Well, hello again, American Lit fans. Welcome to week 2. And so here's just a quick overview of what we're doing this week. You have some readings, an overview of American Lit from the end of the Civil War, 1865, to about 1914, and that is in your Norton Anthology textbook, pages 1 to 17. Desiree's Baby by Kate Chopin, that's also in the textbook, but a lot of these readings are easily accessed online if you do a Google search for Desiree's Baby full text, or any of the titles. You'll be able to find them easily, and some of them are online under the Readings tab under Content. The other short story for this week is A New England Nun by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. And by the way, both of these short stories, Desiree's Baby and A New England Nun, are examples of local color realism, and we're going to talk about local color here in just a little bit. Speaking of which, that's one of your readings, Local Color, Bringing Our True Colors to Light, and I'm going to go through that one with you here in this video, as well as the Intro to Major American Literary Movements and Terms. So if you want to pull those up and sort of follow along with me in the video, you certainly may do so. Both of those are found by clicking on Content up at the top of the page and then on Course Documents in the left-hand sidebar. And then the other item for this week is posting in the Week 2 discussion board. And there are 2 topics in this week's board. And the first one is rhetorically analyzing Desiree's Baby. So we're going to look at that work and break it down, analyze it. And then the second one is considering A New England Nun. So the discussion boards give you an opportunity to really think through both of those texts a little bit more in depth. So let's look at that Intro to American Lit Major Movements and Terms. And again, you go to Content and then to Course Documents, and you will find this sheet. Now, these first ones are before our time, so you will not ever have to know these first few time periods and movements because they're before 1865. But it is a good idea just to familiarize yourself so you have some knowledge of what came before. Native American literature, of course, obviously the first literature in our part of the world. The dates are unclear. A lot of it included myths, oral stories handed down, and much of this was written long before Europeans settled in North America. If you ever have a chance to study Native American Lit, it's fascinating. The Puritan time period, histories, journals, personal poems, sermons, diaries. A lot of it is either religious or utilitarian. Here's a how to do this, right? And we call it Puritan because the majority of the writers during that time were very influenced by those Puritan ideals and values. The Enlightenment Period, again, due to the influence of science and logic, it's marked by political writings. And if you look at the time period, 1750 to 1800, the Revolutionary War, our war for independence, was happening during that time. So we have a lot of political documents, speeches and letters. Ben Franklin, who's one of my favorite little characters, would be typical of the period. I so love his writing. I have a book that I purchased of his not long ago, and it's entitled Fart Proudly by Benjamin Franklin. I highly recommend it. He was quite a little guy. And then the Romanticism period. So we've talked about the Romantics versus the Realists versus the Naturalists. Those are the 3 genres that we're really looking at. But Romanticism really lasted from about 1800 to 1840, so before our period of time begins for this class. And it was a literary and artistic movement of the 19th century. It arose in reaction against 18th century neoclassicism. It placed a premium on idealism, imagination, fancy, nature, emotion, that sort of thing. And so there's a movement from those personal and political documents of the earlier times to entertaining pieces. And so purely American topics are introduced here for the first time, like frontier life. And we can find a lot of romantic elements in the works of people like Emerson and Emily Dickinson and Hawthorne. But it's especially evident in the works of the New England Transcendentalists. Ooh, right? So from 1840 to 1855, again, before our time period. You'll never be asked this on a test, but it's just good to know. So Transcendentalism was an American literary and philosophical movement of the 19th century, and these writers were based in New England. They believed that intuition and the individual conscience transcend everything else. And so they're better guides to truth. That little still small voice inside you, they thought, is a better guide to truth than the senses or the logic, right? And they thought that, the natural world was to be highly respected, that divinity was present in it and in the individual. And there's a lot about their philosophy that I personally really love. So we had famous writers who were romantic writers as well. Emerson and Thoreau and Bronson Alcott, Louisa May's dad. A bunch of those folks. So now we get to our period, Realism, beginning in 1865. So roughly the end of the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century. And we know that it is the presentation in art of real life. And it was a literary movement that began right at the end of the Civil War. It stressed the actual as opposed to the imagined. And we see ordinary people, middle class, in ordinary situations. It's a reaction against Romanticism, rejecting the adventuresome, the unusual, the romanticized, imaginative sort of themes. And then the realists were followed by the naturalists. And they, as we know, looked at things like heredity and environment, and looked at human beings as being helpless to change their situations into which they were thrust. Regionalism, that's another outgrowth of realism, and it's also called local color, and that's the sheet that we're going to look at next. So it really means exactly what it sounds like it would mean. It's the tendency among writers to write about specific geographical areas. That's regionalism or local color writing. So we had people like Willa Cather. We're going to look at her work later on, and William Faulkner as well. And people like the writers we're looking at this week. They present the distinct culture of an area, its speech, its vernacular, its customs, its beliefs, its values. And so local color writing is a type of regionalism. But the regionalists usually go beyond just the presentation of these little weird idiosyncrasies, and they attempt a more sophisticated sociological treatment of the culture or the region. And often, sadly, we had people in charge of the publishing houses back then who would sort of relegate women to being, she's just a local color writer. What does she know, right? When actually a lot of these pieces had depth. Imagism, not imagery, but imagism. And we're going to study that a little later on when we get to it. Flourished between about 1912 1927. It was led by people like Ezra Pound and Amy Lowell. We'll be reading both of those writers. And so imagery, don't confuse these two. Imagery is a technique that almost every writer uses to paint images with words that evoke the senses. But the imagist who wrote Imagism, that was a little bit different because they wrote short works that used ordinary language and free verse, no rhyme. And they wanted to create these sharp, exact, concentrated pictures. Boom, 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 just coming at you. And when we get to that point, you'll see it. The modern age, from about 1915 to 1946, end of World War II, It was an age of disillusionment and confusion, and no wonder. I mean, just look at what had happened, right? We had 2 world wars. And so this period brought us some of our best American writers. They raised all the great questions of life. As almost always in literature, they didn't necessarily offer the answers. And we'll be looking at some of those writers. The Harlem Renaissance, my favorite time in American literature. Can't wait till we get there. So it's part of the modern age. It happened during the 1920s, in the 20th century. Be sure, by the way, that you get your centuries straight. We're right now in the 21st century. Even though it's not 2120, it's 2020. The last century was the 20th century, and that was the 1900s. And the 1800s is called the 19th century, so be sure you get that straight. So the Harlem Renaissance refers to a time of African American artistic creativity. It was centered in Harlem, New York. And so we had these incredible writers like County Cullen, Jean Toomer, Langston Hughes, Miss Zora Neale Hurston. We're going to look at a lot of them. And essentially this period included not just writing but music, lots of jazz music coming out of the Harlem clubs, art, and so it was the first time when African American artists really began taking control of their own work. And then the contemporary period, 1946 to now, great stuff, not really a clear philosophy there, very broad. And then other terms to know, classicism, that's just an approach to literature and the other arts. It stresses reason and balance and ideal beauty and orderly form. So think about the arts and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. That's basically what we mean. And it's often contrasted with Romanticism, again, focusing on the imagination and emotion. Local color, again, the use in a literary work of characters and details unique to a specific little area. So if I was writing about East Ridge and Fannie O'Rear and the Purdy Do Hair Salon and Party Mark, got a sign out front, stop where pleasure starts, Party Mark. Hey, I'd be writing local color. I'd show you how the people of East Ridge really talk. I'd tell you all about that place. And so local color stories became very popular after the Civil War. And they allowed a kind of healing, as we'll see in a minute with the other document after the war. Gothic, primitive, medieval, wild, mysterious, castles, right? So this was before the Romantics. Poe is a good example, before our time that we're studying. And the grotesque, we'll return to this term later in the semester, but it's basically referring to the use of the bizarre or the absurd or the fantastic in literature. So think of Halloween masks, something sort of bizarre. Distortions. And so we'll see it in some of the work of Flannery O'Connor and people like that. So that's that overview. And then the other document that I want to quickly review with you is that local color document. So if you want to pull it up, bringing our true colors to light. Don't you love the way I made that little play on words there? So local color or regional literature is fiction and poetry that focuses on characters, dialect, customs, topography, so the actual geographic lay of the land, and features that are specific to a region. And so it was influenced by Southwestern and down East humor between the Civil War and the end of the 19th century. And so it became dominant in American lit in that time. And so you've got a dual influence of Romanticism and Realism kind of going on, because the author might kind of look away from ordinary life to some distant place or some strange way of doing things, and just think, oh, if I could get out of East Ridge and just go to New York City, right? Remind me to tell you about the time that I did that when I was 16. My parents had the police out looking for me. And our friend Richard Broadhead, oh my goodness, Broadhead, wow, provides a short definition here. He says it requires a setting outside the world of modern development, a zone of backwardness where locally variant folkways still prevail. So like in East Ridge, every house has some plastic pink flamingos in the yard. I mean, it is, talk about your weird variant folkways. And so we've got that vernacular, you know, the use of the dialect, the way people would really have sounded. But there can be some weaknesses in local color. So if I ask you in a quiz, what are the weaknesses? Nostalgia, kind of looking back at the past a lot. Being overly sentimental is one of the weaknesses of local color writers. And sometimes the tendency of the writer to sort of look down on his or her characters and almost be condescending and almost exploitive of them, you know, like if I were writing about Fanny, you know, just sort of be condescending about her and her big thick bifocals and her goth attire and her, you know, drawing of coffins and et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of critics, including our friend Broadhead, have argued that local color contributed to the reunification of our country after the Civil War. So if I ask you, how was it that local color did that? This is how you might answer me. It led to building sort of a sense of national identity again, because Southerners were reading things that writers in New England or parts of the North wrote, and vice versa. Local color stories about their little towns. And the Southerners and Northerners who had been fighting each other literally in the Civil War were now saying, wow, that little town in Ohio where those Yankees live isn't quite so different from my little town here in the South, and vice versa. Because, gosh, we share a lot of the same values and a lot of the same experiences. And so it actually contributed to a narrative of unified nationhood that helped us to rebuild. So those are just some highlights, things that you want to know. You want to be able to define local color, when it happened, and what it was like, and how we recognize it, what its weaknesses might be, etc. Next week we'll have a quiz on realism and local color. And so you want to look back at my videos, you want to look at the sheets, the documents, the discussion board activities to do well. And the other thing that you need to do this week is post in the discussion board, and there are two topics in that board that I think I already mentioned, one about Desiree's baby and one about a New England nun. And then next week we plunge into naturalism, and we're going to look at Stephen Crane's famous poem, War is Kind. Notice the irony there. And we're going to read about naturalism and also post in that week 3 discussion board about naturalism. So thanks for watching, and have a wonderful week, my friends.